All right, so welcome to our deep dive today, and we're going to crack open this book called Abundance, The Future is Better Than You Think.
Yeah, it's by Ezra Klein.
Uh-huh.
Probably know him for his political commentary.
Yeah, very sharp.
And Derek Thompson, who kind of really is good at observing those, cultural trends.
Yeah, and they're making a pretty bold claim, right? That despite all the doom scrolling that we do, the future is actually looking brighter than we think. They argue that we're actually on the cusp of this world with more resources, more opportunities, and just greater well-being for everybody.
Yeah, and it's not just a bunch of, kind of hopeful thinking.
Right.
They structured it like a really strong argument. They
Yeah.
start with the section called the promise, and then they move into the perils, and then finally they outline what they call the path forward.
I love that. I love that structure. So let's start with the promise.
Hmm.
They really kind of dive into all these amazing breakthroughs that are happening right now in fields like renewable energy and biotechnology and artificial intelligence.
Right. And what's so cool is that, these aren't just like theoretical ideas. These technologies are already being used in ways that are improving healthcare and education and even access to things like clean water and food,
Yeah.
all over the world.
I've always been kind of a skeptic about, renewable energy really taking off.
Hmm.
But they highlight how in a lot of places, solar power is already like 30% cheaper than fossil fuels.
Wow.
That kind of data is hard to ignore, especially when you start to think about what could that mean for your energy bills?
Totally. Yeah.
Like it really highlights this idea that we're entering this age of just unprecedented possibilities.
Yeah. For example, they talk about how AI could revolutionize healthcare by analyzing your genetic data to create personalized treatments
Oh, wow.
tailored specifically to you.
Okay, now that's getting into some serious sci-fi territory.
Right. But it's closer than we think, and that's just one example of how technology could be used to solve some of the world's biggest problems.
Okay, so we've talked about the promise of abundance, but Klein and Thompson don't shy away from the potential pitfalls, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely not.
There's this whole section about
The perils.
the perils
Yes.
that stand in the way of achieving this brighter future.
Yeah.
They cover things like wealth concentration, the
Yep.
spread of misinformation, political polarization. I mean, it feels like we are constantly bombarded with these issues in the news every day.
All the time, right. Yeah, and they don't try to, sugarcoat it or anything. They argue that these are very serious threats and they need to be addressed if we want to create a future where everybody benefits from progress.
One thing that really struck me was their discussion on this tension between short-term thinking and long-term planning.
Hmm.
We're often so focused on immediate gains that we kind of end up sacrificing these sustainable outcomes.
Yeah, it's that classic dilemma, do we focus on what's happening right now or do we think about the future, future generations?
Right? It
So-
makes you really think about the choices that we're making, every day, both as individuals and as a society.
Yeah, and it highlights the need to kind of shift our mindset and start making choices that are sustainable, over the long haul, even if it requires, maybe some sacrifices in the short term.
Klein and Thompson also emphasize that achieving true abundance means we have to address systemic inequalities.
Yeah, absolutely.
If the benefits of all this progress only reach a select few,
It's not really abundance, right?
that's not really abundance.
They argue that we need to create a more equitable society where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
So we've talked about the promise of abundance and the perils that threaten to kind of derail it. But what about solutions? What can we actually do to make this vision a reality?
That's where the path forward comes in.
You okay?
They actually offer a bunch of different actionable recommendations for individuals, businesses, and governments.
This is where it gets really interesting
Yeah.
because they propose some pretty bold ideas.
Oh, yeah.
Experimenting with universal basic income.
Right.
I mean,
a huge idea.
it's a radical idea,
Hmm.
but one that is gaining traction in certain circles.
For sure.
They also talk about investing in green infrastructure, which would not only create jobs, but also help combat climate change.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And they argue for a complete overhaul of our education systems,
Wow.
shifting the focus from rote memorization to things like creativity and critical thinking and problem-solving skills.
Yeah, they think we need to really give, future generations the tools they need to not just adapt to change, but to actually be the ones driving the change.
What if we all just went back to school and learned how to code? Maybe we'd be the ones developing these world-changing technologies they're talking about.
Uh-huh, maybe.
Right. But they emphasize that change won't happen just from the top down or the bottom up.
Right.
It requires a really concerted effort from all sectors of society.
It's a collective effort.
Yeah. It sounds like they're calling for this collective shift in mindset and action.
Yeah.
But before we really dive into those recommendations,
Yeah,
I think it's important to kind of look at this book with a little bit of a critical eye.
for sure.
Every deep dive needs a dose of healthy skepticism.
Yeah, definitely.
Let's unpack that next.
Let's do it. So welcome back to our deep dive into abundance. And, we've been talking about all this stuff, about the promise and the perils. But now it's time to get to something even more profound. Like, what does an abundant life actually even look like?
Oh, you've really piqued my curiosity here, because they're not just talking about having a lot of money and stuff, right?
Exactly. Like Klein and Thompson really challenged that idea that abundance is all about like material wealth, possessions and just like constantly consuming more and more.
Yeah.
They argue that we need like a more holistic view, like true abundance is more about quality of life, access to opportunity, and even just like a sense of purpose.
Yeah. I think we've all had that experience where you buy something new and you're like, oh, this is going to make me happy. And then like a week later, it's like,
Totally.
hey, I'm over it.
Yeah, they talk about that and they really encourage this shift away from, just consumption,
Yeah.
and toward prioritizing our well-being.
Well-being.
And it's not just about individual happiness either. Like they really advocate for moving away from, that like me mindset
Yeah.
and more toward a community-focused approach.
So instead of always like wanting more for ourselves,
Right.
you're saying we need to think about like how can we contribute to the well-being of our communities and society as a whole.
Exactly. And they tie this into their recommendations for, fostering global cooperation and addressing those, systemic inequalities that we were talking about earlier.
Right.
They argue that we can't have true abundance if certain groups are, systematically disadvantaged.
That really connects with their point about sustainability over exploitation too, right?
Mhm.
It's about understanding that like our actions have consequences, not just for us,
Right.
but for, everybody else and for future generations.
For sure, they remind us that we're all connected,
Yeah.
and that our well-being is like tied to the health of our planet and the well-being of others.
This is starting to sound less like an economics book and more like a philosophy book about like
Yep.
how to live a good life.
I know, that's what makes it so interesting.
Yeah.
They make us really examine our values and think about, what really matters in life.
Yeah.
It's like redefining abundance as not just like having enough stuff,
Right.
but like a moral imperative to create a world where everybody has the opportunity to like flourish.
Wow. That's a pretty powerful message. It really like elevates the book beyond just, economics and technology.
Yeah.
But wait, are they saying we all have to like become minimalists and get rid of all our stuff?
No, not at all. They get that, having like material security and comfort are important.
Yeah.
But they're just urging us to find that balance.
Okay.
To remember that true abundance is about cultivating a sense of, purpose and connection and meaning in our lives.
So it's about aligning our actions with our values.
Exactly. They're not telling you what to value, but they want you to think about like what you really value and how you can contribute to making a world that reflects, those values.
Okay. I'm sold. I'm ready to start living a more abundant life, according to Klein and Thompson.
Uh-huh.
Where do I sign up?
Well, there's no sign-up sheet, but they do offer some really practical advice in the path forward section.
Okay.
And we're going to dive into those actionable recommendations in the next part of our deep dive.
Perfect. I'm eager to explore those concrete steps we can take to actually move toward a more abundant future, both for ourselves and for like the world. All right. So welcome back to, the final part of our deep dive into abundance. And we've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about the possibility of this brighter future and the challenges and even like what it really means to live an abundant life.
Yeah, and now it's time to, really put on our critical thinking hats
Oh, yeah.
and like examine, both the strengths and maybe some limitations of Klein and Thompson's argument.
They make a really, really compelling case for optimism, but like
Mhm.
no book is perfect.
Right.
So for you, what were like some of the key takeaways? What really stood out as strong? And where did you maybe find yourself wanting a little bit more?
Well, I think one of the things that really struck me about abundance is just how well they balance like hope and realism.
Okay, yeah,
They don't pretend like everything's fine.
right.
They acknowledge that, we've got climate change, we've got inequality, we've got all this political instability,
Yeah,
but they still manage to like make you feel hopeful about the future.
I agree. It's not all like sunshine and roses,
Yeah.
but it's also not like, oh my gosh, the world is ending.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. They find that nice balance, which can be so hard to find, these days.
Yeah, and they're just such engaging writers.
Yeah.
Like they take these super complicated topics and break them down in a way that makes it like easy to understand,
Totally.
without like dumbing it down.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
I mean, I was like highlighting passage after passage, especially when they were talking about the potential of, technologies like CRISPR and how that could like totally revolutionize healthcare.
Oh, yeah.
Like imagine, in the future,
Yeah.
we could just like edit out genetic diseases or create these like totally personalized treatments just for you based on your own DNA.
I know, it's amazing.
It's mind-blowing.
Yeah, but of course, like any really powerful technology, there are also risks,
Oh, for sure.
And some critics say that, like, maybe the book puts a little too much faith in technology as, like, the solution to all our problems.
That's a fair point.
Yeah.
I think technology is a tool.
Yeah.
And like any tool, it can be used for good or for bad, right?
Right.
So it's really up to us to make sure that, these advancements are used ethically and responsibly to benefit everyone, not just a select few.
Yeah, exactly. We can't just rely on technology to fix things, Like, we have to address, like, the root causes of these problems, the systems and structures that create inequality.
Yeah, another critique I've heard is that the book could have maybe explored like the cultural and philosophical dimensions of abundance a bit more.
Yeah, I see that.
Like they do talk about the need for, new narratives and mindsets and stuff.
Yeah.
But I would love to see them really dig into like how things like art and literature and spirituality
Yeah, that would have been interesting.
could contribute to a more abundant future.
Yeah, I agree. But overall, I think Abundance is like a really timely and important book,
Yeah.
Makes us think differently about the world.
It's a call to action, right?
Yeah.
They're not just presenting this like utopian vision. They're actually giving us a roadmap for like how to get there.
Exactly. And that roadmap starts with understanding that we have the power to shape the future,
Yeah.
It's not something that just happens to us. We create the future through our choices and our actions.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a question.
Okay.
If abundance is about more than just like having a bunch of stuff, what does a truly abundant life look like to you? What brings you joy? What gives you purpose? What makes you feel connected? And how can you help create a world where everyone has the opportunity to experience that kind of abundance?
Yeah, those are some great questions, some things to really think about.
Yeah, and if this deep dive has kind of piqued your interest,
Yeah,
we definitely encourage you to check out Abundance for yourself and keep the conversation going.
absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on this journey into abundance. The future is better than you think. Until next time, keep diving deep and keep exploring the world with curiosity and an open mind.